Today you will be learning about how to use the percent equation to solve problems with percents. So you can use your percent equation to solve percent problems, and our percent equation is what we see listed here. Part equals percent times whole. Now this kind of reminds us of our equation in the last chapter, y equals mx. We think of y kind of like the part of our percent. We think of m kind of like our percent. It's like our constant of proportionality, our constant value. And then we have our independent variable, which is kind of like the whole amount, because the whole amount is that constant amount that original amount that we're taking the percent of. So we can think of this very similarly to y equals mx. Now, one way to use the percent equation is to solve for the part in a percent problem. So we see this equation here. What is 25% of 40? So notice that we're trying to find 25% of 40. So that means that 40 is our full amount. That's our whole number. 25% is obviously our percent number, and we're trying to find a portion of that, a part of 40 that represents 25%. So since I'm trying to find the part, I'm going to use a variable for the part. So where I have part equals percent times whole, the part is y, the percent is 25%, and remember, like we talked about a couple days ago, percent means out of 100, so 25% is 25 out of 100. And then we multiply that by the whole amount, just like we see in our percent equation right here. So we set this up as y equals 25 over 100 times 40. Now we have this picture down here that kind of represents it. So we're taking 25% of 40. So we're taking this portion of 40 and trying to see what it gives us. So we're not going to solve this yet, but we're just working on setting these equations up. Now in the next example that we see right here, we see 10 is 25% of what number? So this time we know that 10 is a portion of a certain number. It's 25% of this larger number. So that tells me that 10 is going to be the part. 25%, again, because it says percent, is our percent, so our out of 100 value. And we're trying to find the whole amount. So we set this up as 10 equals 25 over 100 times x. Now in the last example, we see 10 is what percent of 40? So we see what percent, which tells me that I'm trying to find my percent here. So 10 is the part, it's the part here. 40 is our whole amount, that's the entire amount that we're taking a percent of. So we set up our equation, part equals percent times whole, as 10 equals m over 100, because remember percent means out of 100, so we have to put our variable out of 100, times 40. Now a couple things to notice with all of our equations. In the first example, we used y because we were trying to find the part, and remember that the part is kind of like y. In our second example, we used x because that was our independent variable. And for our third equation, we used m because that was our percent, and our percent is kind of like our constant of proportionality. Another thing to notice is that when we have a nice sentence like the ones that we see here, they directly translate into an equation. The order is exactly the same. Like for instance, the second equation says 10 is 25% of what number? So 10 is equals, as means equals, 25%, so we have 25 over 100, of times what number? X. So the sentence directly translates into your equation. Next, we're going to be looking at identifying different parts of our percent equation and what part we're trying to find. So this says, write whether each question or equation is looking for the part, the percent, or the whole. Circle the portion of each statement that led you to the answer. So our first example says 4 is what percent of 6? So we can see here that it says what percent, which tells us that we're trying to find the percent here. Now with our second example, we have 65 equals 30 over 100 times x. And remember that x always, just like we saw towards the top, X always represents the whole amount, which tells me B is going to be the whole amount. Now for C, it says, what is 79% of 126? So we're trying to take 79% of 126. So we're taking a part of 126. So that means that here I'm trying to find the part. Now another thing that you'll start to notice when you have equation or when you have percent problems is that the word next to is always going to be the part, and the word next to of is going to be the whole, just like we see over here. The reason for that is because is usually what we're solving for the percent, and of is usually next to the percent. So we're always taking a percent of something, which means that's the full amount. So where you see the word is, it tells you it's the part. Where you see the word of, that's going to be the whole amount. Now let's look at example D. So we have an equation, and we're solving for m. Remember that m represents our percent in the percent equation, so that means it's a percent. For E, we have y equals 0.48 times 21. Notice that that's the variable by itself, and we are solving there for the part. Y represents the part. And then for F, we have 4% of what number is 12. And since it says of what number, remember that keyword of tells us that it's the whole amount. Now go ahead and flip over your papers. So we're going to look at solving some percent equations. So the first percent equation that we see on the other page is 11 is what percent of 50? So every time when we set up a problem like this, we want to start off by rewriting our percent equation. And you can just write it with variables like what I did here. So I wrote this as part equals percent over 100 times the whole. Now in this equation, we know the part, we know the whole amount, but we're trying to find the percent. So I set this up, and notice how it translates directly down. 11 is equals what percent, m over 100, of 50, so times 50. Now when I'm solving this, you'll see that the first step that I did was divide both sides by 50. My reason for that is because I want to get rid of anything that's not attached to the variable first. When I take 11 divided by 50, that gives me 0.22, so I have 0.22 equals m over 100. And then this next step that you see here is just like the things that we did in the last chapter with solving proportions. I have 0.22 equals m over 100. So that's m divided by 100, and if I want to cancel that out, I have to multiply both sides by 100, and that's going to give me 22 as my answer. And because I have my percent set up where it was m over 100, that value that I got out was the percent amount. So I write that as 22% for my answer. So 11 is 22% of 50. Now let's look at the top of our second example. So our second example, we have 25 is 4% of what number? So notice that keyword of right there. That tells me that I'm looking for the whole amount. So I set up my equation, I rewrite it again, and you should do this every time. Part equals percent over 100 times the whole. From there, I plug in my values. So I know the part. I know the part is 25. I know the percent is 4, so I write that as 4 out of 100. 4% means 4 out of 100. And then I multiply that by x because I'm trying to find the part. Now what we see in this equation right now is that we have this fraction that really can be simplified, or it can be made into a decimal to make it easier to work with. So I would do that before you do any other step. So 4 divided by 100 gives us 0.04. So we're going to make that 25 equals 0.04x. From there, if I want to get x by itself, right now I have 0.04x, which means 0.04 times x. So if I want to get rid of the 0.04, I divide both sides by 0.04, and that gives me an answer of 625 for x. So to answer our question, 25 is 4% of 625. And when we look back at that, that makes sense because 4% is a very small part of this larger number. So it makes sense that a very small part of 625 would be 25. Okay, looking at our next example, we have what is 40% of 60? So for this example, I know that I'm trying to find the part because it's next to is. And notice I'm taking 40% of 60. That means I'm taking 40% of this full amount. So again, we rewrite our equation first, and then I know that I'm going to be solving for the part. And the part we use y for that. So I write y equals 40%, 40 out of 100, of times 60. From there, you just have to simplify. And just like the last few, we'll just make 40 out of 100 a decimal to make it easier to work with. So we have y equals 0.4 times 60, which gives us y equals 24 as our final answer. Okay. So those are our 3 examples that we've seen where there's just a quick sentence that asks us to find either the part, the percent, or the whole. Now the next example that we see is more like a word problem. So let's read it together. It says, a hairdresser is paid $7.50 per hour. After a year, he is to receive an 8% raise. Is the information in the letter correct? So in this letter, it says, congratulations, you have earned a raise. They give us the current wage, $7.50 per hour, the percent raise, and then they say that the raise amount should be 55 cents per hour. Now what we want to see is that this raise amount is correct. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my original wage and I'm going to see what 8% of that would be and see if it ends up being the same amount. So I set up my equation just like before, part equals percent over 100 times the whole. And because right now he's getting paid the whole amount, $7.50, and we're trying to find just a small part of that that's going to be his raise, we know that the whole amount is going to be $7.50. The percent is 8 over 100, and we're trying to find the part. This is very similar to the last example that we saw in the part that we just finished. So we're going to take part equals 8 over 100 times 750, change 8 over 100 to 0.08, divide those numbers. It's going to make it easier to work with. And then we get part equals 0.08 times 750, which gives us a total of 60 cents for the part. So what that tells us, looking back at the problem, is that an 8% raise would be 60 cents. But they said that the raise amount was 55 cents, so the information in the letter was not correct. So at this time, you can start doing your homework. Please make sure that you are showing every step just like what I showed you on this video.